Creepypastas have become synonymous with the internet. Originating on 4chan in the early 2010s, creepypastas come from the word copypasta. Copypastas are usually defined by a big wall of text that is copied around and used on the internet. So naturally, creepypastas are a horror version of copypastas, stories that are scary that are spread around the internet. There are millions of creepypastas, good and bad. However, there is one that started a whole new subsection of creepypastas. In August of 2012, sonic.exe was released. Because of sonic.exe's success, many other creators decided to make their own video game creepypastas. And in my opinion, the most interesting video game creepypastas to me were always Pokémon. So I created a iceberg chart with the most known to the least known Pokémon creepypastas. So let's begin with layer 1. Lavender Town Syndrome. Lavender Town Syndrome is a urban legend surrounding the town in red and green. In the game, it is stated that this is a burial ground for thousands of dead Pokemon. The legend goes that when Red and Green was released in Japan, child self-harm cases also spiked, most in children who were playing Pokemon and reached Lavender Town. The suspected reason is because of the sound frequency, having sounds that only children could hear. This is one of the most infamous creepypastas, fooling many children and even getting articles written about it. Hypno's Lullaby. Hypno's Lullaby is a creepypasta centering around the psychic Pokemon and his Pokedex entry in the original games. The entry goes, quote, "It carries a pendulum-like device. There was once an incident in which it took away a child it hypnotized. There was an actual creepypasta written about the kidnapping and even a fan game created. However, the most iconic part of the story was the poem uploaded by trainer Derek on November 10th. The poem begins with Hypno luring away a group of children, and as the poem continues, he slowly becomes more violent and creepy. Missing No. Missing No is a glitch found in the original Pokemon games. Watching the old man's demonstration and flying to Cinnabar Island and surfing down the coast, Missing No will appear. During your fight with Missing No, you can duplicate items, however catching them will forever corrupt your game. It is one of the most iconic glitches in video games, being referenced in Binding of Isaac. Lost Silver. Lost Silver is a Pokemon creepypasta surrounding Pokemon Silver. The story begins when a college student buys a used copy of Pokemon Silver. Previous save file was still on the cartridge, the trainer had no name, and everything was completely maxed out. The only Pokemon that the trainer had was a group of unknowns that spell out leave and a Cyndaquil named Hurry. The player will then head down a red hallway, and upon reading the sign, it'll say that his Cyndaquil has died. Now there were 6 unknowns, reading out he died. As the game progresses, the player slowly loses all of their limbs. Eventually, the player finds Red, who looks like a transparent ghost. Red sends out a Pikachu that looks very sad, while Gold uses a Celebi. Both Celebi and Pikachu die, and Gold is sent to a house. Phasing through the wall, you can then talk to Red, who tells you goodbye forever and uses a move called Nightmare on you. Gold is then taken to a grave, where his unknown now say, "I am dead." I had to do the rundown of this story because it's very, very long. If you want to check it out, then I'll leave a link in the description. Buried Alive. Buried Alive is a creepypasta that claims that in the files of Red and Blue, there was a scrap boss in the Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town. Upon arriving at the top of the tower, instead of a ghost Marowak waiting for you, a half-buried corpse would ask you to join him before initiating into battle. The corpse had 4 Pokemon, a Gengar, a Muck, and strangely enough, 2 white rotting hands. Beating the corpse would just freeze the game, completely break it. However, losing to him would give a special game over screen. The game over screen would show the corpse holding the trainer's body, dragging him down with him. Ash is in a coma. Ash is in a coma is a theory relating to the Pokemon anime. In the first episode of the anime, Ash gets struck by lightning, which the theory says that he never woke up from. This explains everything that happens in the series, from Ash staying 10 throughout the rest of the series, and why he never won the Pokemon Championship. This really isn't new because plenty of other shows have theories just like this, such as Adventure Time. Snow on Mount Silver. Snow on Mount Silver is a creepypasta that is probably most known for the fan game based around it. The story starts off with a girl reminiscing about playing Pokemon with her brother. Eventually, they begin to use cheats with a Game Shark. Eventually, the brother goes crazy and smashes all of his Pokemon stuff and murmurs something about everything being really white and then going to darkness. To find out why her brother went crazy, she decides to put in the Game Shark codes, eventually landing on one called Easter Egg Snow on Mount Silver. When loading into the game, you are on top of a mountain. Snow was covering the screen and the player had a Typhlosion, Feraligatr, Magninium, Pidgeot, Tyranitar, and a Lugia in their party. As the game goes on, your Pokemon slowly die, leaving you only with your Typhlosion. At the top of the mountain, you begin a fight with Red. His Pokemon are also rotting and frozen. Red's final Pokemon was Pikachu, who used Pain Split that killed not only Typhlosion, but also himself. The game would end with Red becoming a corpse and something using Destiny Bond on the player. However, in the game version, there's a jump scare from that Pikachu. Strangled Red. Strangled Red is a creepypasta that dates back all the way to October 30th, 2012. The story goes of a player finding a Pokemon Red cartridge in the trash. Booting up the game, the player wasn't allowed to choose his name or his rivals. Steven was the player, and his rival, named Mike, who happened to be his brother. The rest of the game was fairly normal, making it to the Elite Four and beating his brother. However, once beating the game, your brother would ask you to trade him Miki, your Charizard, so he could finish his Pokédex. During the trade, a loud snap could be heard and Miki died. The game then skips a year. Steven has been warped with grief. His hair is now long and he looked very disheveled. Steven then decides to seek out Missing No to somehow bring back Miki. Missing No then proceeded to bring back Miki, however they weren't the same. Steven was now a husk of his former self, and that night strangles his brother. Pokemon Creepy Black. Pokemon Creepy Black is a Pokemon creepypasta and ROM hack that revolves around a bootleg copy of Pokemon Red. During the beginning of the game, instead getting a Squirtle or a Charmander, you get the Ghost from Lavender Tower. Throughout the rest of the game, you used a ghost, and instead of defeating trainers, the ghost would curse them and kill them. At the end of the game, the ghost kills you and shows you all the trainers and Pokemon that you killed. Come Follow Me. Come Follow Me is a Pokemon creepypasta that's red and green in Japan. In the story, a significant number of kids ages 10 to 15 have committed self-harm since the release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan. The police began to conduct an interview with some of the people who worked on the game. One of them suspected that the music of the game had caused the incidents, however, there were no signs to show this. Police began to play the confiscated games, noticing the same trend, like only having one Pokemon and low playtime on the save file. The police then began investigating a programmer who died from self-harm shortly after the game's release. His apartment was littered with letters and notes to come follow him. In another separate interview, a programmer died, harming himself and saying, "Don't follow me." Eventually, they interview a man who says that they added something to the tall grass outside of Pallet Town. During the interview, something goes wrong, and the interviewee and all the police were found dead. Years later, a detective begins looking into the cold case. He begins playing the copies of the Pokemon games, and eventually in the tall grass outside of Pallet Town, the thing from the tall grass says, "Come follow me. I miss you, Dad. I miss you, my husband." And recently, the detective's family had died in an accident. Later, the police found the detective dead and they destroyed the rest of the copies. Curse of the Unknown King. Curse of the Unknown King is a creepypasta relating to Pokemon Silver. The story begins with a kid home alone on Christmas, getting a knock on the door and a package at his doorstep. Inside the envelope was a letter. In the letter, it said, "Keep this, I don't want it anymore," with a copy of Pokemon Silver. On the other side of the letter, there was also a note that says, "Continue playing the current save file and complete the Pokédex." The child was very excited to get to complete the Pokédex. He catches his first Pokemon that he needed, Celebi. However, strangely enough, when the child caught Celebi and sent it to the box, it said Celebi was sent to Pandora's box. After catching the rest of the legendary Pokemon, he checks the note on what to do next, saying, now to put in your party a Mew, a Celebi, a Ho-Ho, a Lugia, a Suicune, and a Moltres. The third task says that at 3 AM, go to the Alpha Ruins, enter the main chamber, and then go down to the last statue following the corridor down. Once in front of the corridor, put down the unknown radio signal and talk to it. After talking to the statue, the child's party was gone, and a text box popped up saying, "Your team's sacrifice has allowed the release of the Unknown King." In the Pokédex, there was a new entry, an amalgamation of unknowns. The entry read, This ferocious beast can sleep for centuries, and when it wakes, it will kill anything for food. As the game goes on, NPCs begin to go missing, and the boy has to fight the unknown king, which he promptly loses. Gengar is Clefable's shadow. This is a theory relating to the Pokemon Gengar and Clefable. Firstly, they look very similar, and the original Pokedex entries had to do with the moon. Disabled. Disabled is a Pokemon creepypasta that is centering around Wigglytuff, the evolution of Jigglypuff. The story begins with a girl getting a copy of Soul Silver and wanting to get a Wigglytuff in the game. She eventually caught a Jigglypuff in the Savari zone, however she still wanted a Wigglytuff, so she decided to do a wireless trade. 2 weeks would go by with no response, until a trainer would be willing to trade a level 26 Wigglytuff, oddly named Disabled. The girl, wanting to test her new Pokemon, got into a battle with Ponyta. However, when the trainer tried to use Sing, the text would say Sing was disabled. The girl tried to leave the battle, however text popped up reading, "Disabled wants to fight. You cannot leave this battle." And when Ponyta went to attack, it shook, and the game said Ponyta was frozen in fear, it might not attack. The rest of Disabled's moves began not to work, and text filled the screen saying Disabled tried using Sing. Each time the text passed, Wigglytuff's sprite turned darker and darker. Disabled began using Struggle and hurting itself, and Ponyta eventually fled from the battle. After the battle, Disabled begins lamenting the fact that he can't sing before trying to steal the player's Sing. Explorers of Death. Explorers of Death is a Pokemon Mystery Dungeon creepypasta. The story begins with the writer getting a copy of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky at their GameStop. When starting the game, it would prompt you to do a personality quiz, and the writer wanted Vulpix, however they kept getting Squirtle. The child, frustrated, took to the internet to find out how to get the Vulpix, and after taking the quiz again, they would get the Vulpix. After the quiz, a cutscene would start. Everything looked desaturated, and Vulpix was bloody and washed up on a beach. Approaching was a Shinx, who dragged them back to their den. After nursing the Vulpix back to health, the Shinx would ask Vulpix its name, which was Myra, and Shinx would reveal its name as Shadow. Shadow would begin charging up the electric attack and told the player not to move, however Vulpix ran away. Vulpix would then appear in a dungeon. The floors were littered with skulls, and then a limping Rattata would attack the player. As the dungeon got deeper and deeper, the rooms would become more gory. At the end of the dungeon, Myra would be confronted by a Squirtle, bloody and beaten with red eyes. Shadow would catch up with the player and beg Squirtle not to hurt Myra. However, Squirtle thinks that Shadow is being influenced by Myra and fills the screen with static and jump scares the player. Myra would wake in the void. All the starter Pokemon would stand around the player and begin to attack, almost knocking out Myra. During this, Shadow confronts Squirtle, who is upset that they weren't chosen at the beginning of the game. Shadow would save the player, but lost their life in the process, and the player reset the game and chose Squirtle. Upon meeting Myra again, Squirtle would stab her. Bootleg Pokemon. Bootleg Pokemon is a video/ROM hack created by Vibing Leaf, a horror artist most known for their remakes of classic creepypastas. The video begins with the uploader talking about a strange ad that they got for a quote-unquote free Pokemon game. When opening up the game, you would be introduced to an off-looking Pikachu who calls himself Hotaku. Hotaku requests you to bring him some animals to eat, so the player heads out and kills and skins animals for Hotaku. The first animal doesn't fight or respond, however the second becomes angry, and taking the skin back to Hotaku, he says he's proud of the player and there's only one more left. The last animal tells the player that they should love themselves and care for themselves, and after killing the animal, the player brings Hotaku the skin, but the player refuses to give Hotaku that skin. A battle commences. The player tries to shoot Hotaku, however it doesn't work. As a last resort, the player chooses the skin option and the player is taken to a place called the Black Hole. In the Black Hole, Hotaku chastises the player and the rest of the animals that you killed explain that they need something to escape. However, Hotaku blocks the text and makes them disappear. Poor Rival. Poor Rival is a creepypasta/fan theory relating to your rival in Red and Blue. After the battle on the SS Anne, your rival's Raticate is never used again, some saying that the reason being your rival not making it to the Pokemon Center in time. After the rival's Raticate died, the rival would hold resentment for the player. Using this resentment, he would go and beat the champion, only for you to beat him seconds after getting the badge. Purin. Purin is a strange entry on the list because it doesn't have a definitive creepypasta. Although I could not find a confirmed creepypasta based on the image, it seems that there was a long forgotten ARG surrounding the image. It seems like the ARG is based on a lost episode of the anime, and you could email certain characters about the episode, but I'm not fully sure. It also seems that the image is just generally associated with Pokemon creepypastas, being the thumbnail on a Lavender Town video, and also being a thumbnail on a Pokemon Creepy Black video. Pokemon Dark Green. Pokemon Dark Green is a creepypasta that says that there was a version of Pokemon released in the United States that no one remembered. Instead of having Venusaur on the cover, it instead had Scyther. The story begins with the player becoming obsessed with Pokemon, really wanting a copy and getting one for his birthday. However, this copy was different. There was only one of it, and it was Pokemon Dark Green with Scyther. When starting up the game, the player would attempt to leave their house, however there were no stairs and none of the objects in the room were interactable. No matter what the player did, he could not leave the room, so the player's father agreed to go get him a new copy. This time the player got a copy of Pokemon Red and enjoyed the game, placing his copy of Green in his drawer to be forgotten about. Years later, when asking his friend about Pokemon Green, his friend didn't believe him that there was a copy of Pokemon Green with Scyther, and when trying to show his friend the copy of the game that he put in the drawer, the cartridge wasn't there. Eventually, the player finds the copy the next day and begins to play, finding out that there was a boulder in the room that was pushable with the Scyther in their party. Entering the room, the player would be bombarded with messages saying dark, and they would have to use flash from his Scyther. The player would head through the tunnel and would enter Pallet Town, where none of the NPCs would talk to you, and Oak wouldn't let you leave to Viridian City and would attack the player. After your battle with Oak, he would beg you not to leave, saying that you would die if you leave for Viridian City. Once at Viridian City, the player would attempt to battle the first gym leader, who revealed himself to be Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket. Giovanni would use a level 100 Scyther and would swiftly beat the player, however going back to the gym would say that Giovanni had lost. Giovanni would beg the player to escape before getting sliced in half by his Scyther, and his Scyther would then go on to kill yours. Pokemon Blood Edition. The story begins with two kids going to the game store and getting Pokemon. However, there is only one copy, so the kids agree to share it. A few days later, the writer decides to call up his friend and finds out that he's currently missing. Talking to the missing boy's mother, she reveals that the only thing left was a note saying game over in red ink and a copy of Pokemon. When opening up the game, the intro would begin. However, things looked very realistic, showing Squirtle killing Charizard. The trainer, which was strangely named after the writer, had 6 Pokemon, a Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle, Butterfree, Pidgeotto, and the 6th Pokeball was blacked out. The players spawned in on Mount Moon, where they could see Gary having a confrontation with Professor Oak, who jumps off the cliff. When heading into the cave, the player would be attacked by Team Rocket member James. James chooses Wheezing and attacks both himself and your Charmander, before saying James has died. Afterwards, the player would encounter a shadowy version of Red. Red would use a black Charizard, and once the player's team would be defeated, their 6th Pokemon would reveal itself as Pikachu. Pikachu would pull out a warped Pokeball before the game would let out a shriek, leading to the game crashing. Years later, the player's son would say that they wanted to be a Pokemon master, just like Steve, his missing friend. Forgotten Red. Pokemon Red begins with the writer finding a Pokemon Red cartridge on their way home from a birthday party. The player would attempt to make a new game, however the game wouldn't allow him. The player would hit the continue option and would load into Pallet Town. The trainer's name was Red and he had 8 gym badges and infinite money. The trainer's Pokemon were the exact same as Red's team from Pokemon Silver. He had a Pikachu, Venusaur, Blastoise, Charizard, Snorlax, and a Lapras. The player would be given the TM Waterfall by Professor Oak, and would go to the world border and use Waterfall, breaking the barrier, allowing the player to enter New Bark Town in Johto. The player would head further into the region until they got confronted by a monochrome version of Gold with a level 100 Typhlosion, who wiped out the player's whole team. After losing, the player would be teleported to a black void. His whole team had gone down 10 levels, and one of the 8 gym badges was replaced with a bloody Y. The player would continue throughout the game, and would slowly lose his Pokemon. Each time one of them died, a new letter would be replaced, eventually spelling out "Stay away." The player would be attacked by Gold once again, and he would use a level 265 Ho-Oh and beat the player once again. After this, the player would be taken to a game over screen where you could hear the distorted screams of Pikachu. I am not a clone. The story begins with the trainer wanting a Ninetales. Realizing that there's Vulpix in Cinnabar Mansion, he heads off to Cinnabar. The trainer would enter the mansion and would begin to feel ill. However, he continued to chase the Vulpix, eventually backing them into a corner. The trainer would successfully catch the Vulpix, however, he would notice a strange journal on the floor. The journal was ripped apart, however, the player could find out that the writer had been conducting DNA experiments with the Pokemon Mew, creating Mewtwo. The player would begin talking to Mewtwo in his head, revealing that he is the trainer and that there is no clones and that he is the original Mew. Nurse Joy. Nurse Joy is a creepypasta relating to the Doctor in the Pokemon games, and this story aims to give a reason why they all look the same. First, it begins with Nurse Joy putting a tracker on the player so they can contact the other Nurse Joys. Then, if you refuse her option to heal your Pokemon, then they'll take you to another room and request you to put all your items in a drawer. Then, later in the night, the nurse would enter your room and would stab you with a syringe, causing you to fall asleep. Afterwards, she would take you to her room, blood covered the walls, and human body parts hung from the ceiling. She would conduct strange experiments on the player, resulting in them becoming a nurse themselves. Glitchy Red. The story begins with a writer finding a new copy of Pokemon Red off of eBay. However, when the game arrived, the writer could tell it was some kind of bootleg. The writer would begin playing the game, and there wasn't anything wrong. There were small things like the player's sprites being strange colors, but nothing that couldn't be chalked up to being a poorly made bootleg copy. However, in this copy, Red would ask questions like, where is his father, and who created him? The player eventually decides to do the missing no cheat, but Red would stop him. After this, the player would slowly learn that Red is sentient. Red would have a monologue about how they portray Red in the recent Pokemon titles, demoting him from protagonist to final boss. Red would ask the player if they saw him as a joke, and the writer would respond with no. The writer would begin having nightmares where he was a Pokemon trainer getting chased by some pale figure. Sometime later, the player would beat the game. Red's trainer card at the end of the game had scratch marks all over his chest, which the author says he's been experiencing since the nightmares. Pokemon Death Snap. Pokemon Death Snap is a creepypasta relating to the N64 game Pokemon Snap, a Pokemon spin-off where you take pictures of Pokemon in the wild. The story begins with the writer reminiscing about his old N64 and his favorite game Pokemon Snap, and after playing the game on his friend's Wii, he decides to dig up his old copy. When starting the game, strange distortions would happen. Professor Oak had no pupils and a purple hue on his left side. The first level was distorted too. The Pokemon were all glitchy and they had the same purple color as Oak. They also acted cold and unnatural, like they were afraid of something. The player would begin to take photos like usual, however right before the player exited the level, something would begin chasing them and Oak would comment that you let something in and to go to the tunnel. The player would continue playing and these distortions would become increasingly worse. Eventually, the player fell off the buggy and would fall into the lava. Afterwards, the player would be confronted by Oak, who would heckle the player for letting it get you. The player would be then taken to a scene of Todd's charred corpse, with all the Pokemon that he had taken pictures of were dead in the background. Suddenly, a demonic voice called out, "Say cheese," before the whole screen turned white and photos of the writer's mutilated corpse appeared on screen. Glitchlet. The story begins with the writer explaining that back in the summer of 1999, all of his friends were hooked on Pokemon. However, they began to become bored. One day, one of their brothers introduced them to Missing No, and the kids began to do glitches. However, there was one glitch that had no record anywhere, and only the writer remembered it. He states that you would have to talk to an NPC, fly to Celadon, where the player would encounter a strange glitchy Diglett. The Diglett was extremely powerful, wiping out every Pokemon it encountered. However, late one night, Diglett died fighting a wild Pokemon, and once the player exited the battle, strangely, Diglett could still use Dig. The player would ultimately use Dig, and they were taken to a glitchy, distorted version of Diglett's cave. Here, the player would encounter a deformed version of Dugtrio. The player's Diglett would suddenly have no moves, and a text box would appear reading "No Hope." After losing the battle, the Diglett would appear bruised and bloodied, and before the player could continue the fight, the Game Boy would die. Tarnished Gold. The story begins with the writer getting an old copy of Pokemon Gold from his grandmother who found it at an auction. Instead of the game opening on a cutscene like normal, a black screen with text would appear reading, Pokemon are nothing more than tools, use them, and throw them away. Instead of the game focusing on Gold, the normal trainer, it instead focused on your rival, Silver. The rival would choose Totodile, however when the player attempted to name it, the game would say, "Don't name it, you'll only get attached. Don't love it, use it." The player would encounter Gold, who swiftly beat him, and after losing to the gym leader, Silver would get the option to steal the badge from the gym leader. As the game would continue, the trainer would steal from all the prominent trainers and would get all the items and badges that he would need to continue. The player would eventually make it to Kanto, and when the player entered Viridian City, the music would begin to glitch and the gym looked like a maze with bodies strewn around the floor. The player would enter the center room and would catch a scene of Gold's Typhlosion dying in battle. The person who was battling Gold would reveal himself to be Giovanni. Silver would side with Gold, which enraged Giovanni, who would send out Mewtwo. Giovanni reveals himself to be the one telling the player that the Pokemon are useless, which enraged Mewtwo, who would begin attacking Giovanni. After killing Giovanni, Mewtwo would claim that Silver was useless and would attack and kill the player. Blue's Tears. Blue's Tears begins with a person finding a Pokemon Blue cartridge at a yard sale and picking it up for a little bit of nostalgia. Upon opening up the previous save file, instead of the game starting, a text box would appear reading, "I've been robbed of everything. My title is champion, my grandfather's respect, even my Pokemon are dead because of you. I won't stand for this. I will come find you." The game would fade on to Blue, who was standing over a grave in the Pokemon Tower. Blue would leave the Pokemon Tower and fly away with Pidgeot, heading to Mount Silver from Pokemon Gold and Silver. Blue would confront Red, and upon starting the battle with him, Blue would pull out a knife and attack Red. Red's sprite would begin to let out a terrible screeching noise before collapsing. Blue would then speak again, saying, "See you in hell," before Blue would turn the knife on himself. White text would then fill the screen, reading, "I finally got my revenge. The life you ruined is now faded away. But don't think it's over yet. My suffering has ended, but yours has only begun. I'll be watching your strife with a grin on my face, and when it all ends, I'll see you in hell." The next day, the writer would see on the news that the man who sold them the game had confessed to murdering his wife, which weeks before, his son murdered his younger brother, and then himself. Forever Mine. The story begins with the writer learning about the legendary sky Pokemon Shaman. However, the event to get Shaman in Pokemon Platinum was over, so the player decides to cheat to get the Pokemon. The player would encounter a legendary Pokemon and would proceed to catch it. However, the player would have to talk to an NPC to get Gracia flowers to evolve the Pokemon. However, the NPC wouldn't give the player the item. Months later, the player would decide to trade their Pokemon to their copy of Pokemon Heart Gold. Once the player loaded into their game, they would decide to get rid of all their cheated legendary Pokemon, including the Shaman. The next day, when the player got on Pokemon Gold, multiple Shaman were in the player's box. All of them looked mutilated, and when all their names were combined, it said check Platinum. The player would get on Platinum, and as they continued, the game would become more bloody, with gruesome organs littering the paths and blood filling the oceans. Suddenly, the player would be attacked by a Shaman, and the only option the player had was to catch the Pokemon. Afterwards, the Shaman would begin to transform into the Sky version, however they looked horrific. They had a twisted grin, and their cry sounded like a mix between the land form and the sky form. Shaman would begin to speak, asking if the player would love them now that they were the sky form. The player would rip out their copy of Pokemon Platinum, throwing it away, instead playing Pokemon Gold. Upon opening up Pokemon Gold, Shaman would confront them, saying, "I told you you'd be mine forever." Jessica. The story begins with the writer getting a copy of Pokemon Blue and instantly becoming obsessed with the game. The writer had a particular fondness for Pikachu, and when she caught one, she named it after a friend who had recently moved, named Jessica. Over time, the writer slowly becomes more attached to Jessica, getting them to level 100, and even saying they saw Jessica as a little sister. However, one day there was a friend that came over and accidentally evolved Jessica, which deeply upset the writer. One day, the writer comes home from school extremely mad. Past friends began to bully her, and in a rage, she accidentally breaks her copy of Pokemon Blue. Years later, the writer's brother would suddenly pass away, and looking through his old possessions, they would find the old broken copy of Pokemon Blue. To help pick up their spirits, the writer's girlfriend suggests that they pick up Pokemon Black and White and play together. The writer would once again become hooked on Pokemon, even catching a Pikachu and naming it Jessica. The Pikachu would begin talking to the author, asking if they remembered who they were, and when the writer would attempt to evolve Jessica, they would refuse. As the trainer continued throughout the game, Jessica would become more and more angry that they didn't remember who they were, eventually telling the player, "You're a liar, a cruel, heartless killer." The writer would attempt to show some friends the strange messages, however it would just show Pikachu's stats. The player would once again be confronted by Jessica, who gave them a yes or no option. Jessica would say, "I thought you cared. I thought you really cared. Wasn't I special to you? Cameron, wasn't I your best friend?" Which the player would respond with yes. Jessica would then speak again. "Yes, we were partners, you and I. We took on Team Rocket together. We conquered Kanto, Johto, even Red together. I thought you cared, but I was wrong. You let rage get the better of you. You snapped me like a twig. You crushed me, as well as my heart. You killed me. You're a murderer, Cameron." Jessica would then tell the writer to meet them at Celestial Tower. The Pikachu would then be missing from the party along with all the other Pokemon turning yellow. The tower was dark and dreary. All the NPCs were berating the player, saying that they betrayed them. At the top of the tower, Cameron would be confronted by Jessica. The Pokemon had large gashes across its body and its fur was stained with blood. Jessica would then ask the writer if they regretted what they did, which the writer would respond with yes. White text would appear on screen, reading, "Jessica believes you." Jessica would then appear on screen with a faint smile. The rest of Cameron's team would appear to finally be at peace. Jessica would then appear on the trainer's party, happy and healthy, and would thank the player for never forgetting them. Prevention of evolution. Prevention of evolution begins with the writer looking on the internet for action replay commands to get a shiny Eevee. The player would decide that they wanted all the shiny evolutions, so they would begin to spawn in Eevees to evolve them. The trainer would begin to level up one of their Eevees when they noticed something that was a bit off. Every time that they killed a Pokemon, instead of saying it fainted, it said they died. The player would get Eevee to level 52, and they got a message saying that Eevee wanted to evolve into Espeon. However, the player already had Espeon. The player would refuse the evolution, and text would appear saying Eevee wants to evolve, and Eevee's sprite would become angry. The player would then attempt to put Eevee back in the box, however text would appear reading, "Eevee won't go without a fight." The sprites in game would appear with bloodstains covering them, and the trainer's Pokemon refused to fight. The player would ultimately lose the fight, and would appear in a dark forest with bones and rotting flesh strewn about. Text would then appear reading, "Eevee wants you to suffer," before Eevee would attack the player. Eevee looked like a strange mix of Espeon and Eevee, having Eevee's body but Espeon's ears and tail. The player's only option was to try and catch Eevee, however it refused and used the move Kill on the player. The player would then be taken to a black void where Eevee would say, "You should have let me evolve." Hell Bell. The story begins with the writer's brother giving them all their old Pokemon games as a gift after he became disappointed with recent generations. The writer would then notice that her brother used an action replay to complete the Pokedex, so she began trading some of these hacked Pokemon. From these trades, the writer would receive a level 100 Bronzong nicknamed Hellbell. Strangely, all the Pokemon stats were 666, which made the writer uncomfortable because they were somewhat religious. This would cause the writer to attempt to trade back the Pokemon, however the game wouldn't allow them to return Hellbell. The writer, before deciding to release the Pokemon, would notice that the Pokemon had an item, that being a letter that read, "Take me back." Despite this, the trainer would still attempt to put the Pokemon in the box, but Hellbell refused, saying, "I can't go back on my own, take me back." The player would presume that the Pokemon wanted to be taken to the Lost Tower, where it had been caught. So, the player would head to the Lost Tower, and once inside, Hellbell would toll 3 times, and the tomb in the middle of the room would disappear, causing the player to fall in. The trainer would find a room surrounded by lava. In the middle stood a gentleman trainer who would thank the player for returning their Pokemon. The man would ask for the player's name, and when attempting to type in her brother's, since it was his save file, the man would request their real name. Once submitting their real name, the trainer's sprite would transform into a replica of the writer's in real life, and the man would say, "You're now mine." After this strange occurrence, the writer hasn't been the same, unable to sleep, eat, and even animals avoid her. Stay out of the tall grass. The story begins with the trainer becoming lost in the tall grass, and suddenly the grass would begin to shake, which upset the trainer's Mighty Anna. The trainer would brush it off as being some wind, however Mighty Anna would only become more aggressive, quickly rushing into the grass. Mighty Anna had become extremely restless, almost mauling his trainer. However, the trainer would notice on the sides of Mighty Anna there would be small wounds. Suddenly, the wind would knock the trainer to the ground, and Mighty Anna would begin to howl and attack at something the player couldn't see. Mighty Anna would quickly become overwhelmed, and the trainer would awake to the corpse of Mighty Anna laying on the ground with a blood-drenched Scyther towering over them. Missing No Murder. The story begins with the writer explaining that him and his brother in their younger years would play Pokemon almost constantly together, trying to complete the Pokedex and get their Pokemon to extremely high levels. The writer's brother would eventually become bored and would begin to look up cheats online, eventually finding the infamous Missing No cheat. The brothers would then spend the day looking and attempting to capture the glitch, eventually doing so. Brothers would begin to mess around with the cheat and eventually decide to link battle. However, during the battle, strange things like their health bars would fluctuate rapidly and random status effects would come into effect. All of these things eventually led to both of the boys' games crashing. The writer would lose his Pokemon in the battle, Machop, saying it died in battle and the writer couldn't find any more in the overworld. Weeks later, the brother would begin playing again and would use Missing No in a battle, and after defeating the NPC's Growlithe, she would say, "My poor sweet Growlithe, if only I knew you would be so cruel. What do you want? Leave me alone. How could you be so heartless? We battled to train and learn about our Pokemon, to get close to them, like I did to him. Just get out of here." The writer would explain that in early stages of Pokemon were meant to die, and Missing No's glitch effect somehow re-triggered it. Pokemon Doomed Black. The story takes place weeks before Pokemon Black and White was released. The writer, who hadn't played a Pokemon game before, wanted to experience a past game before buying a new one. At a flea market, the writer would find a used copy of Pokemon Gold. It was extremely beat up and the sticker on the front was peeling off, however the man selling it gave it to them for free. Upon loading in, the title screen was dark, the sky was pitch black, and there was no ho-ho flying on the screen, and the title just read Pokemon. The player would load in like normal and would get their starter Totodile. However, when the player went to go check on their Pokemon, it showed another Pokemon in their party. The Pokemon was Ghost from Lavender Town. The player would begin a fight with a wild Marill, which, just like a previous creepypasta, Pokemon Creepy Black, Ghost would use Curse, killing the Marill. After defeating the Marill, the trainer would notice that Ghost could level up, so the trainer would continue to attack and kill Pokemon, eventually leading to a text box appearing saying Ghost evolved into Phantom. Phantom wore a cloak over their head, had long arms, and huge claws. The player wanted to test out their new Pokemon would encounter a wild Bulbasaur. The player would notice a new move called Devour. Using the move would cause Phantom to begin eating the wild Bulbasaur. Eventually, Phantom made it to level 31 and would again evolve, this time being into Spirit. Spirit had glowing red eyes and sharp blood-stained teeth. Its body was dark like Ghost, however its cloak now revealed its head. Spirit's new move was Decapitate. Using the move would cause the screen to go black and a slashing noise could be heard. After the black screen would fade away, it would reveal the organs of the last Pokemon that you attacked. The player would eventually make it to the top of Mount Silver. Here they would face Red, and after killing all of his Pokemon, he would say, "You will be sorry." The game would skip many years. The trainer, who was now much older, would adventure through Johto, which was now covered in blood and bodies. Once entering the trainer's old home, he would be teleported to the ruins of Alph, where he would encounter Red, who would say, "You really done it now, Jack." The player would then suddenly be attacked by Spirit, who would show all the Pokemon the player killed, and then kill the trainer. Zombreon. The story begins with the writer's friend telling them about how in Pokemon Gold, Eevee was originally planned to have a Ghost and Poison type evolution, however it never made it in the game. The writer would begin playing a beta copy of Pokemon Gold, and would eventually find an item called Toxic Stone, however the item did nothing to the Eevee. The player would begin asking NPCs, and eventually stumbled on an NPC who would say, "Did you know that there is a stone that evolves a Pokemon after it faints?" After Eevee fainted, the player would use the stone on the Pokemon, evolving it into Zombreon. Zombreon had the same spray as Eevee, however it was green and parts of its body were gone. With the evolution, Zombreon would gain a new move, that being Zombite. The move caused the opposing Pokemon to always faint. However, the strangest aspect of the move was that after you defeated the Pokemon, it would be sent to your box without even using a Pokeball. The opposing Pokemon always looked green and was a poison type. As the game would continue, other trainers would begin to disappear, and all the other Pokemon in the tall grass would become infected. The trainer would become hesitant to kill Pokemon who weren't infected. However, when they would attempt to run from a Pokemon that wasn't, Zombreon wouldn't allow them, saying Zombreon was hungry. The player would head to the Pokemon Center, where other NPCs would begin attacking him. However, during the battles, no matter what the player did, it would always end with Zombreon using Zombite. The game quickly became desolate, with houses becoming boarded up and newspapers reporting on the strange green Pokemon. Zombreon would begin attacking everything in sight, Pokemon, and trainers, only making the outbreak worse. Previously in the story, one of the NPCs had called the player not normal, and surely enough, the player's sprite was now green, just like the others. When the player went to the PC, it would give them the option to release all the infected Pokemon, and when the player went outside, buildings began to be set on fire, and NPCs were running from the green Pokemon. The trainer would head to New Barktown, where they would encounter the professor, who said, "I've finally finished it, a gene that protects my Pokemon from the poison stuff that has caused all the Pokemon to turn strange. This is where it began, this is where it will end." The professor's Pokemon were unaffected by the attacks of the trainer. His Pokemon also had a move named Cure, which would one-shot all the trainer's Pokemon. The player would be forced to use Zombreon, who after being put at 1 HP would use Struggle and kill the opposing Feraligatr. After the battle, the professor would take a step back and say, "I lost. It's over. It's all over. I want to end this pointless game right now," and ran out of the lab. Minutes later, a loud bang rang out. The trainer would go back to the house that he originally started at to go check on his mom, and when trying to talk to her, the game would read, "It's Mom. She's not moving. I am your gift." The story begins with the writer introducing a cheat for Pokemon games on the DS. The cheat allows you to get any event Pokemon from the era. To access these Pokemon, you would need people to open up addresses, which the player would ask a internet forum for, which they wouldn't get very many responses since it was pretty niche. However, they got a private DM from someone they didn't recognize. The account would say, "Hello my friend, I heard you were seeking a Pokemon server DNS. This is for Pokemon Black and White and it will help you obtain secret Pokemon. Try it and you will be surprised," and would provide a DNS link. From this code, the player would receive a Arceus, and the game would say, "See you tomorrow," and when the player would get on the next day, they would also receive a Mew. The player would also receive a key item named "See You Tomorrow." The item was one of Mew's arms. On the third day, the player would receive a Rayquaza, and would also get another arm, that being of Rayquaza. On the fourth day, the player would receive a Celebi, and once again get the arm of the Pokemon, which read, "I am your gift." At this point, the writer is becoming fatigued. He begins losing sleep and becomes aggressive, saying that he hasn't felt right since he began receiving the gifts. On the fifth day, the writer would receive a Yveltal, a Pokemon not even from this generation. The player would also receive the wing of that Pokemon. Weeks would pass, which the writer would describe as a slog. The writer, who at this point had been put on sick leave by his boss, who began to notice him struggling to stay awake at work. However, the writer continued to accept gifts, receiving Cresselia, Darkrai, Latias and Latios, Keldeo, Azelf, Dialga, and finally Reshiram, also receiving the various limbs of said Pokemon. Once the player received all the Pokemon, a text box would appear saying "Create Us," and would get the option to fuse all the Pokemon arms and limbs together. The creature of all the limbs and arms would begin a battle with the player, and the creature would say, "Good morning, we are beautiful, thank you for creating me." After catching the creature, it would say, "As I am your gift, you are mine," before the game would crash, letting out a grinding, wailing screech of corruption. Pokemon Beta Green cutscene. The story begins with the writer wanting to relive some nostalgia and buying a new copy of Pokemon Leaf Green online. One day, while scrolling through the cheats for the game, the writer would find a cheat to trigger a beta cutscene for the game that was taken down moments after being posted. First, you had to defeat the Elite Four multiple times, and upon doing so, the writer would be told by their rival that they were going to train on the SS Anne. The player would then head to Bill, the Pokemon scientist that turns himself into a Pokemon, and would request help from the player to return to his human form, which they would agree to. Then the cutscene would begin. The trainer would walk over to one of the portals and would be sucked in. Just like in the caves, an image would flash on screen for a second, this being the corpses of multiple Pokemon like Pikachu and Vulpix. The trainer would be released from the portals, where Bill would say, "Now you know my secret, I'll take you to my secret garden." The player would then be taken to the gardens, where an image would once again appear, this time being even more gruesome, with human bodies strung about. The game would end with the trainer getting killed by Bill. Pokemon Rotted Yellow. The story begins with a little boy coming into a game store and claiming that his Pokemon game was broken. The boy said that he'd get to a specific area and then all his Pokemon would faint and then the game would crash. Our writer, who works at the game store, decides to help the kid out and takes the game home to attempt to fix the cartridge. When the writer got home, they would notice something strange on the cartridge. Pikachu's eyes on the sticker had been scratched off. The writer would have to start a new game because the game's previous save file had been corrupted. When the trainer loaded in, they would instantly be teleported to Lavender Town and suddenly encounter a wild Mew. However, all the options to battle or capture Mew didn't work, causing the player to have to reload a save. After this, the game would continue like normal, and the player would get the Sylph Scope and would encounter the Ghost Marowak. However, the Marowak would transform into Mew, which would cause the trainer to lose. The player, instead of spawning in the Pokemon Center, would be at the bottom of the Pokemon Tower, and where the battle usually takes place, there would be a grave that let out their Pikachu's cry. Once the trainer got to their 7th Pokemon, they would lose to Mew and be teleported to their bedroom. The player only had one mystery Pokemon in their pouch that could only use teleport, where they'd get teleported back to the Pokemon Tower. At the top of the Pokemon Tower, the trainer would see a grave of themselves and then be attacked by a shadow trainer who used the same Mew to kill the player again. The writer then mentions that the boy who originally gave them the game never came back for their cartridge. BRVR. The story begins with the writer getting a GameCube for their birthday, and one of the games that they would receive would be the Pokémon Channel. Pokémon Channel is an obscure Pokémon spin-off where you help Professor Oak by watching episodes of the Pokémon anime and playing various minigames. When the player loaded in, they would get an option to name their Pikachu, which they would name BRBR, which is short for brother. See, at the time, the writer was struggling making friends, so they decided to use Pokemon as an outlet and Pikachu as their best friend. However, one day, they dropped the game and stopped playing for a while, only to pick it up years later. The player would load in, however BRVR was nowhere to be seen, and moments later the Pokemon would climb out under the bed looking beat up and depressed. Suddenly, the player would get a knock on their door in the game, which contained a gift that held a new TV called Pikachu TV Z. The TV was strange. It was Pikachu's head, its mouth was the screen, and it had sharp teeth hanging down. The player would also receive a few more gifts, like blood red walls and a Pikachu doll that had blood stains and sharp teeth. The player would begin watching channels with BRVR, however there was some kind of disturbing twist to each channel, like blood dripping from the screen or those creepy dolls showing up. However, usually when the player stops looking at the screen, Pikachu would motion for them to keep watching, but BRVR would keep watching the TV, seemingly unbothered by the player's absence. BRVR would walk over to the player and ask him a question, "Do you still love me?" which the player would respond to with yes. However, BRVR would just turn back the screen, and text at the top would say, "BRVR knows when you're lying." At this point, the writer would attempt turning off the game, however they only got a message reading, "Game cannot reset at the moment." BRVR would then take the player outside, and the world was destroyed. The sky was a dark red, and dead Pokemon corpses littered the player's yard. BRVR would then begin messing with the player, asking if they wanted to know what they did with the place, and throwing corpses at the trainer. BRVR would then take the player to Viridian Forest, where trees were burned and more Pokemon corpses were strewn about. BRVR would then force the player to play various messed up games, like rock, paper, scissors with organs, or fishing and catching Magikarp that foamed at the mouth. The player would question why BRVR would do this, which the Pokemon would respond with, "I did this for you." BRVR would reveal a secret place in the Ruins of Truth. The walls had writing saying things like, "Where is she?" and "I'm so lonely." BRVR would then say, BRVR was abandoned by his best friend years ago, to be replaced by a new friend, and was left to rot alone in a virtual world. True or false? Which the writer would respond with, "True." The screen began to fade to black, except for BRVR, who said BRVR wants you to suffer the same way he did. The game would then shut off, and the writer would walk over to their desk where one of the weird Pikachu dolls laid. And that was the end of the Poképasta Iceberg. This video was really enjoyable to make. I got to revisit some creepypastas that I hadn't heard about in years, and getting to revisit them was really fun. Before I say goodbye, I want to thank some people. Firstly, Spin Master Mugen for allowing me to use their music on Layer 1. You've probably heard their music before. Their music was featured in Blame It on George's videos. However, I am extremely grateful for them allowing me to use their music in mine. In the description at the end of the links for all the creepypastas, I'll put the link to their channel and the song that I specifically used, so you can go check it out for yourself. And secondly, I wanted to thank you for not only watching this video, but getting me to 1,000 subscribers. That's a huge milestone, and I can't wait to keep making content for you guys. So if you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe, because I'll definitely put more content out like this, and leave a comment about your favorite Pokemon creepypasta. And if I missed your favorite creepypasta, then leave it in the comments, and maybe if I get enough replies, I'll do a part 2. Anyways, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!